The sun was setting over the Peruvian Andes when Simon Yates made a decision that would haunt him forever. With shivering hands gripping a knife in the howling wind, he faced an impossible choice. Cut the rope and let his friend plummet into the abyss, or be dragged to his own death on the frozen face of Ciula Grande. In the end, he cut, and so began one of the most extraordinary survival stories in mountaineering history. A tale that would challenge our understanding of human endurance and the unwritten laws of the mountains. The year was 1985, and the mountaineering world was changing. Gone were the days of massive expeditions with endless supplies and fixed ropes. A new generation of climbers was pushing the boundaries of what was possible with lightweight, alpine-style ascents. Fast, minimal, and incredibly dangerous. Among these bold pioneers were Joe Simpson and Simon Yates, two ambitious British climbers in their early 20s. Joe Simpson was a dreamer with a deep connection to the mountains. Born in Malaysia in 1960 to a British family, Simpson's childhood was anything but static. His father's military career took them across the globe, exposing Joe to a world of adventure. By the time he was a teenager, he had settled in England, where he first encountered the rocky landscapes that would shape his life. Climbing offered Joe something he couldn't find elsewhere: a sense of purpose and freedom. It was a blend of artistry and adrenaline, a dance with danger that only a few could truly appreciate. But Joe wasn't reckless. He was meticulous, always calculating risks, even as he pushed his limits. By his mid-20s, he had already gained a reputation in the climbing community for his audacious goals and technical expertise. Simon Yates, on the other hand, was a quieter force, equally skilled, but less inclined toward the limelight. Born in 1963 in England, Simon grew up with an appreciation for the outdoors that eventually led him to the world of climbing. Where Joe was fiery and driven, Simon was methodical and calm, making them an ideal pair. Their partnership was built on mutual respect, trust, and an unspoken understanding that the mountain came first. Their friendship was cemented during climbs across Europe and South America, where they honed their skills on challenging peaks. Simpson and Yates had already made names for themselves in the European Alps, but they hungered for something bigger. Their eyes turned to South America, specifically to a shark's tooth of rock and ice rising 20,814 feet into the Peruvian sky. Ciula Grande. While not the highest peak in the Cordillera Huayhuash range, its west face had earned a fearsome reputation. Multiple expeditions had tried and failed to scale this technical nightmare of near-vertical ice and treacherous cornices. It remained one of the last great unconquered challenges in the Andes. What made their attempt even more audacious was their approach. With limited funds and a purist philosophy, they planned to climb alpine style with only the bare essentials. No fixed ropes, no multiple camps, no backup team. Their entire support consisted of Richard Hawking, a non-climber who would watch their gear at base camp. In the event of an emergency, help would be days away across treacherous terrain. The mountain itself seemed designed for fatal situations. Its west face was a complex maze of ice fields and rock bands, with conditions that could change from perfect to extremely dangerous in minutes. Storms would regularly engulf the peak, turning day into night and dropping temperatures well below -20 degrees Celsius. The thin air at that altitude would make every movement a struggle, every decision clouded by oxygen-starved thinking. But perhaps most dangerous of all was the climber's own ambition. Both Simpson and Yates were part of a generation that prided itself on pushing limits, on dancing along the knife edge between boldness and recklessness. They had seen friends go from this world to the next in the mountains, yet like most young climbers, they carried that peculiar conviction of their own immortality. They knew the statistics, that 1 in 4 climbers who attempted peaks over 20,000 feet never returned. But statistics were for other people. As they made their final preparations at base camp, neither man could have imagined how their story would unfold. In the days to come, they would experience triumph and disaster, make choices that would be debated for decades, and push the boundaries of human survival beyond what anyone thought possible. The stage was set for what would become one of the most remarkable chapters in mountaineering history. And as the sun rose on their first morning on Ciula Grande, neither climber suspected that they were about to become legends. Not for the climb they planned, but for what would happen when everything went wrong. The climb began in perfect conditions, the kind of weather that makes mountaineers believe in divine intervention. As Simpson and Yates moved upward through the pre-dawn darkness, their crampons crunching into pristine snow, they made rapid progress. The mountain was offering them a rare gift: stable ice, minimal wind, and clear visibility. Too perfect, perhaps, for seasoned climbers, know that mountains rarely give without taking. By midday, they had navigated the first major technical challenge, a series of ice cliffs that required delicate front pointing with their crampons and precise ice axe placements. Each swing of the axe had to be perfect. One slip would mean a fall that the thin alpine air would make impossible to arrest. The exposure was total. Thousands of feet of empty space below their boots, the kind of position that makes even experienced climbers' palms sweat. But as they climbed higher, the mountain began showing its teeth. The temperature plummeted, and the wind picked up, driving ice crystals into their faces like tiny needles. The air grew thinner, making each step a battle against burning lungs and leaden legs. They were entering what climbers call the unaliving zone, altitude where the human body begins to deteriorate rapidly. Their progress slowed to a crawl as they encountered the crux of the route, a near-vertical ice wall that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Here, they ran into their first serious problem. Their gas canister was malfunctioning, meaning they couldn't melt snow for water. In the thin air, dehydration would become a seriously dangerous enemy. After 16 grueling hours, they finally reached the summit. But experienced mountaineers know a sobering truth. The summit is only halfway. As they began their descent, the sun was already setting, and with it went their last reserves of warmth. What they didn't know was that the mountain had been setting a trap, waiting for precisely this moment of exhaustion to spring it. The first sign of disaster came with a sound, the quiet but unmistakable whoosh of snow giving way. Joe Simpson was down climbing a steep section when his foot punched through a snow bridge. In the fraction of a second before tragedy struck, he had time for one thought: this is going to hurt. The fall was violent. His leg caught between rocks as his body continued downward, resulting in a compound fracture of his right tibia and fibula. The bones exploded through his knee, tearing through flesh and his climbing suit. In the bitter cold, the only mercy was that the extreme temperature somewhat numbed the excruciating pain. Their situation was now critical. In high-altitude mountaineering, above 19,000 feet, rescue is virtually impossible. Injured climbers are typically left behind. But Simon Yates refused to accept this unwritten law. In a display of loyalty that would later prove tragically ironic, he devised an ingenious but desperate rescue plan. He would lower Simpson down the mountain 300 feet at a time, the length of their climbing rope. It was a plan that no reasonable climber would have attempted. But altitude has a way of making the impossible seem possible. For hours, they continued this painstaking process. Lower, wait, climb down, repeat. It seemed to be working until they reached an ice cliff. In the darkness, Yates couldn't see that he had lowered Simpson over an overhang. Simpson dangled free in space, unable to signal his predicament to Yates above. The bitter wind swallowed his screams for help. The rope connecting them, their literal lifeline, was now their biggest threat. The weight of Simpson's hanging body was slowly pulling Yates off his precarious stance. Ice was forming on the rope, making it impossible to pull up. As Yates's snow seat began to collapse, he faced the most horrific decision any climber could imagine. The next few moments would change both their lives forever and set the stage for one of the most incredible survival stories ever documented. For 5 agonizing hours, Simon Yates held his position, his body shivering from cold and exhaustion. If he maintained his position, both would eventually freeze. If he tried to pull Joe up, the force would drag him off the mountain. There was only one other option, the one every climber is afraid of. The decision itself took seconds, though its weight would last a lifetime. With frozen fingers, Yates pulled out his knife. The rope, that sacred bond between climbing partners, went suddenly slack. The aftermath was a blur of guilt and survival instinct. Yates descended through the night, his head torch beam revealing nothing but swirling snow. He was convinced he'd just ended his friend. The mountain's fury intensified, as if to punish him for his choice. When he finally reached their snow cave, he was physically and emotionally shattered. But mountaineering isn't a sport of simple moral absolutes. In the climbing community, Yates's decision would spark decades of intense debate. Many argued he had no choice. Others questioned whether he could have waited longer, tried something else, found another way. Yet while this ethical storm brewed, neither participant knew that the story was far from over. As Yates began his guilt-ridden descent to base camp, something extraordinary was happening in the darkness below. Joe Simpson was still alive, and what would follow would become one of the most incredible survival stories ever documented in mountaineering history. The true impact of Yates's decision, both its necessity and its consequences, would only become clear in the days that followed. But in that moment, alone on the mountain, he was simply a man who had violated climbing's most sacred trust to save himself. As the rope disappeared into the darkness, Neither climber could have imagined how their story would ultimately end. Joe Simpson's first sensation was confusion. He was alive, suspended in a massive crevasse, his shattered leg somehow supporting his weight on a narrow ice bridge. Above him, the rope end dangled mockingly. The fall had been around 150 feet, a distance that should have made him leave Earth. Instead, he found himself in what he would later describe as an ice grave. The crevasse, paradoxically, had saved his life. Its narrowing walls had slowed his fall, and the ice bridge had caught him. But at minus 20 degrees Celsius, with a compound fracture and no climbing gear, his survival seemed merely prolonged rather than possible. The pain in his leg was unbearable, each movement sending shockwaves of agony through his body. He had no food, no water, and no realistic chance of rescue. Simpson discovered that while climbing up was impossible, going deeper into the crevasse might offer salvation. He located a steep snow slope that disappeared into the darkness below. Using his one good leg and his ice axe, he lowered himself down, entering what he believed might be an ice tube. After a 30-foot descent, he found the crevasse's bottom opened onto the glacier. This discovery marked the beginning of an almost supernatural journey. With his right leg useless, Simpson began crawling across the glacier. He fashioned a splint from his foam sleeping pad, allowing him to drag his shattered leg behind him. Every movement was agony, but he established a rhythm. Crawl for 20 minutes, rest for 5, repeat. For 3 days, Simpson continued this torturous progress. He ate snow to combat dehydration, though this further lowered his body temperature. Hallucinations began. He heard music, imagined conversations, and felt a distinct presence accompanying him. This phenomenon, known as the third man factor, is common among solo survivors in extreme situations. The distance he covered, 5 miles, seems modest until you consider the terrain. The glacier was a maze of crevasses, and Simpson had to navigate them with no rope and one leg. He could only move during daylight hours, spending nights in makeshift snow holes, shivering uncontrollably as his body temperature plummeted. When Simpson finally crawled into base camp, he was barely recognizable. His weight had dropped by 42 pounds. His right leg was severely infected, and he was suffering from severe dehydration, hypothermia, and exhaustion. Simon Yates, who had been preparing to leave that morning, was struck speechless. The physical recovery took months. Simpson underwent 6 surgeries to repair his leg, though it would never fully heal. He spent years learning to walk normally again, fighting through chronic pain that continues to this day. But perhaps more remarkable was the psychological aftermath. Rather than blame Yates for cutting the rope, Simpson publicly defended his partner's decision. Their story, immortalized in Simpson's book Touching the Void, and later in the award-winning documentary, became a case study in mountaineering ethics. The climbing community, initially divided over Yates's decision, largely came to accept it as the right choice under impossible circumstances. The experience transformed both men. Simpson continued climbing, though never at the same extreme level. He became one of mountaineering's most respected authors, his books exploring the psychological aspects of climbing and survival. Yates also continued climbing, but struggled for years with public perception and his own guilt, despite Simpson's forgiveness. And that's the true survival story behind Touching the Void. But it's also a story that raises tough questions. What would you have done in Simon's place? Could you have survived as Joe did, facing the void alone? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.